Thank you all. This is going to be an exciting panel about building a culture that supports creative thinking and innovation. I think what we'd like to glean from it is to get some insight into big corporations who've built successful cultures, as well as understand the key elements needed to create the right culture in any organization, from an intermediary company to a startup, and when that should take place. So I thought, since we got brief introductions from everyone, we should probably dive in and maybe start with Andy and Alan and hear a little bit about the cultures within Facebook and Google.
All right, well, testing, but yep. So Google, I think, is interesting. About 12 years ago, Google was a startup. We kind of think of ourselves as an overgrown startup, and I think we certainly tried to espouse many of the values of a startup. One of the things that I think has made Google successful, and I think is something that really does foster, creativity and innovation, is creating a very strong culture that is a real meritocracy. Now, you've probably heard this bandied around a lot, but really, your authority comes from your ideas. It doesn't come from your title. I mean, on paper, I'm the most senior engineer in Google Australia and New Zealand. I'm the director. But I can tell you now, that means nothing at Google. Ideas come from everywhere. In fact, I've had interns that spent all of 12 weeks with us over the summer that came up with brilliant ideas that we ended up launching. So really, honestly embracing a meritocracy where you not only encourage everyone to basically participate and share their ideas, and also reward those behaviours too. And we heard earlier from Andy about celebrating success too. I think so. That's another aspect of that meritocracy, that when ideas are surfaced and heard, then we also reward that too and celebrate those successes. So that's probably, I'll just start with that. I think that's something that has enabled us to kind of maintain, I think, a really creative environment. There's other aspects that kind of enable. You can't really have a meritocracy without also having a large amount of transparency within the company. One thing that I think Google does very well is that pretty much, again, anyone from the most senior SVP down to the lowliest summer intern has more or less full access to everything there is to know about Google. Essentially, access to almost all of our source code, access to all of our processes and systems. Everything about the company is extremely transparent, extremely accessible too. So that also enables ideas to kind of come from all kinds of interesting places. It's possible to kind of see something in another area that may not be your immediate focus area, but because things are open, it enables these kind of cross-pollinations to happen too. So I'll let Andy have a few words.
Yeah, is it a meritocracy at Facebook? Can you describe the culture there?
I think big picture, companies kind of reflect the values of their founders or the most important person, around the world. And I feel like at Facebook, we have a wonderful kind of openness. Like we have a Q&A every Friday with Zuck, and he is he's a very impressive person, I have to say. And you can stand up there without the fear of God and ask him pretty much anything, from like his favorite superhero into like what's happening with the relationship with Apple or Google or something like that. And it's an open plan office, so he's not hidden away. Cheryl's not hidden away. You can actually kind of swing past and see them working. They're real people, which is pretty special. And even down to the fact that we have these hackathons that come up like maybe 3 or 4 times a year. I feel like people perform well when they feel like they're reaching their maximum potential. And at Facebook, you have a lot of opportunities to actually be able to surface that. So if you have a good idea, people are going to give it oxygen. So in a hackathon, for instance, you get to kind of down tools and work on something else. It might be a day. Last year we did one for 3 days in a row. People drink Red Bull. You'd be happy, Andy. Stay awake. There's one kid with his Yahoo series hair, and he stayed up for 3 days in a row building something. And then at the end of it, if you have an idea which you're really happy with, you get 2 minutes to present it to all the the most important people in the company, and that's a really great opportunity. And kind of to your point, Alan, it doesn't matter if you're like an intern there or you're some wily old veteran. If you have an idea, then people will actually stand behind it, and to be able to have that kind of creative outlet, I think, is really important for people, because I feel like if you're not reaching your potential. If people kind of feel crushed in a job, then they usually kind of stray away, I think.
So Tom, would you describe that as a successful culture? Is that what companies want to aspire to, Facebook and Google?
I mean, we're a much different place. We're 5 full-time employees, and we have 18 people working in the company totally. I come down, I occasionally have lunch with Andy, and it's free, which is, they have a lot of money. We're a self-funded startup, and so I think one of the things that shapes our culture is a space we're in. And we have the luxury, actually, I own a consulting company in brand and design strategy. We work with companies like Nike and their innovation kitchen. And so the internet company Mindstorms is embedded in Bassett & Partners, which is actually a client of the company. So it's this learning laboratory where they're constantly being exposed to what our customer is really looking for. So that's really important. And then I wrote up a list of other things that we've done as a culture to sort of keep creativity alive, and I think that it's very deliberate in many designs. Like, we have a ping pong table and it actually gets used. So I think that incorporating play into an organization is huge. I know how many self-funded startups out there, just out of curiosity? Like money's hard, right? We're self-funded, and early on, I had this moment where I went to buy a song on iTunes for 99 cents, and my credit card got declined. So, you're under a lot of pressure, right, to raise revenue, and we're a sales-driven model. But so counterintuitively to that, we actually incorporated play into our culture in a very active kind of way, and so we have documentary Wednesdays, we show films and bring lunch in. We do Thirsty Thursdays where we have beers in the afternoon and tacos and chips and that kind of thing. Or Fedora Fridays, we have a 90-degree rule. So if it's over 90 degrees outside in San Francisco, we actually close the office. For those of you who know San Francisco, that's a low-risk thing to do. It hasn't happened yet. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think play is a big part of creating a culture of creativity and innovation in your organization. And it may go counter to your instincts early on when you're just under so much pressure to deliver revenue and stem, the bleed of costs.
Thank you. Eric, what would you cite as some important ingredients in building a successful culture?
Well, it's kind of interesting listening to these guys talk. So I run a consultancy firm that specialises in cultural development. And so we work with very large organisations that are trying to change their cultures, often to try to imitate the sort of things we've been hearing today, and small cultures that are going through rapid growth. And I agree completely with what you were saying before, Andy. The culture is always a reflection of the founder in some manner. It usually is. And one of the interesting characteristics is that if you listen to Mike talking this morning about his experiences he was talking about culture all the time, and he was consciously leading and growing his culture. So your organisation is going to have a culture. That culture is going to grow and evolve. It will happen. It's whether or not you're going to lead it is the question. And the things that underpin the creativity and the openness and the transparency, from my point of view as an organisational psychologist looking at it, it's trust. Those things contribute to what we would see as a positive, internally motivated, trust-based culture. So transparency, openness, meritocracy, all of those things need high levels of trust in order to thrive. So building trust and all those things contribute to that. So the people doing it may never have said, hey, we're going to build trust, but that's what they've been doing. They've been building that kind of world.
And then back to you, Alan. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, if I can follow up to that, being a small company competing with talent in this area and industry, I think, particularly for a smaller organization where I'm a startup, your culture is more important. It's a form of currency for attracting talent. We've attracted people who had offers, no disrespect, from Google, and Tesla Motors and companies like that, and they came to us. And I mean, I can't tell you how happy that makes me as an employer. So you actually have to fight harder on a cultural basis, I think, to attract people who align with your value system.
Having a mission helps. I mean, having something that people care about, and Google has its mission, obviously, which I won't repeat. But I think if you can basically inspire people with your mission, you will attract people. And that's, I guess, also part of what the founder has to establish. Make it, the mission for the company is something that people believe in and are excited about.
Can I ask how long you've been at Google, and have you seen the culture evolve?
I've been at Google just over 6 years, so for half of the company's existence. I'll add my entire time at Google, apart from regular visits back to the mothership here in Mountain View, has been in Google Australia. So Google Australia was tiny when I started. It was essentially a sales office with a dozen engineers that had just resulted from an acquisition we made. In fact, Lars Rasmussen founded a little company. It was a 4-person startup company. So again, the synergies between startups and multinationals, and it was quite serendipitous that he just happened to be in Sydney, and we had a sales organisation there, and Lars, and again, this is just this serendipity effect, because his partner at the time happened to be Cuban and didn't want to live in the US because of restrictions placed on Cuban nationals, said, I'm not moving to the US. Personally, he'd be quite happy to live in the US, but he couldn't or wouldn't. So, Google said, okay, we'll set up a little engineering centre in Sydney and see how it goes. There was no great plan to have an R&D or an engineering team in Sydney at the time. And then Lars did that for a few years, but he realised, his passion was basically actually designing and building products. So they kind of brought me in, I guess, to kind of take it to the next level. So when I joined, there were about 15 engineers in total. In Sydney. Now we have almost 400 engineers, just 6 short years later. So it has felt like a startup, except with free food and great coffee. But in terms of the pace of growth has been staggering. Yes, we've had the resources and we've had large staffing teams to go out and find talent around the world and pull them to Sydney. But it has very much felt like a very, very fast growth startup within a much larger company. And actually part of the culture, yes, although Google does have a global culture, and Larry and Sergey have certainly instilled or imbued that culture, a big part of what I think has made Google Australia successful is we've localized that culture, because you just can't take, a Silicon Valley, I would not say there's a Silicon Valley culture, but what works in Silicon Valley will not necessarily work in Sydney or anywhere else, Beijing or Bangalore for that matter. So that we've adapted it in our own fashion. So,
can you give me some examples of Australian adaptations?
Well, there's lots of things that we like to do. For example, Australians like their booze. So you'll see, I used to boast that we had more minibars and wine fridges in the office than we had product managers. I'm not sure if that's still the case, but pretty much, it's things like that have just made it more comfortable for Australians, in particular Australian engineers. We've made changes that we thought worked better for us in a number of different ways. The types of outings we do, reflect the things that Aussies like to do. I would say we do a lot more outdoor outings. It's not to say our American colleagues don't, but we know proportionally many more. We do a lot more sailing. We do a lot more adventure sports. We do, these are things that kind of suit the Sydney and the Australian lifestyle. There are things we don't do as well, though. I think, and this is perhaps part of our, vestigial kind of poppy-lopping, cringe, whatever you want to call it. We are probably a bit too modest in a way. I think one of the reasons you do, as an entrepreneur, do want to spend time in Silicon Valley, although I don't agree it's a must thing to do in terms of moving your company necessarily, but I do agree it's absolutely important to spend time in Silicon Valley just to understand, that it's okay to shout your successes. It's okay to kind of, I don't want to say big note yourself necessarily, but you've got to be good at communicating to others what you're doing. So, we're learning, part of our success comes not just from doing great things, but also communicating those great things, and so adapting to, different styles and all that. But lots and lots of little things. Yeah. Probably no one silver bullet. It's not that simple. Sure. It's funny in this age of instant video conferencing from your favorite web browser, which hopefully is Chrome. You can shameless plug. Sorry.
That's it. The Silicon Valley spirit. There you go.
Yeah. Sorry, but it's there's no substitute for actual face-to-face. It's the reason I'm here this week, and apart from being here also, but you do need that face-to-face time too.
Right. And Andy, switching to Facebook, what surprised you joining the company and seeing the culture there?
What surprised me most? I think the fact that there's a saying around work that we're 1% done. And I feel like, I have moved around the world and I've got friends all over the place and family, so I was a pretty avid Facebook user, actually. When I was at Apple. It was actually funny to start working at Facebook and it was okay to be on Facebook. I was like, I guess it's all right. Hey, this is great. I'm working.
And actually, I want to hear a little bit about the comparison too, because you have worked for Apple and Facebook, two of the hugest kind of companies. And were there kind of stark differences between the two?
There was, and this I can probably hook back to it. So I think there's a saying around work, we're 1% done, and the fact that the model doesn't exist and we're building and testing and iterating and doing a lot of stuff is really exciting. So there's a real entrepreneurial spirit. I started a company before and I actually loved that because I could actually sleep at night knowing I only had to worry about anything I could pull the levers with. Like, if there was a problem, I could either solve it or I couldn't solve it, but I didn't have to worry about all the layers kind of above me. So the fact that it's still in infancy, connecting the world, it's kind of like the yellow pages and the white pages of the world, Facebook, in its simplest form. And then Apple, has been around 30 years, and I don't know if probably a lot of you guys have read the Steve Jobs biography. If you haven't, it's a great read. And he was a very, very specific person. He made a small number of really large bets. So when you worked at Apple, it was your job prescription was very precise. I went through the Apple University course and basically said, think of a Swiss clock, and you're hired to make number 2 because you're a great number 2 maker. You're the best number 2 maker in the world. You don't have to worry about number 1 or number 3 or the time and date that's flipping around or what the band is made of. You just have to make number 2. And so some people work really well in that environment and some people don't. So it was a very kind of measured, precise, for kind of high impact versus what can we do to change the world in the future, depending on your role there. But that was a big contrast.
Interesting. And now, Eric, we often hear from a startup, that creating a good culture is so important, but how do you actually go about doing that? It sounds fairly simple, but what are the first steps?
Well, I think that it's an interesting question because we usually get brought in when something's gone wrong. So typically what happens is that it's been a startup, there's been some growth, you brought in some new staff, you went from 20 people to 60 people, you're a year or so into, a couple of years into it, and all of a sudden everyone's going, gee, it used to be fun here. What's happened? So the organisation loses some of its DNA on the way. And so one of the most important things around that is to, think about what it is you want your culture to be like. So when we get brought into an organisation, we actually do a cultural snapshot where we talk to a cross-section, if not all of their staff, and come back and go, this is what your culture's like. And often the really noticeable things about the culture, people have taken for granted because they did it intuitively, because it was just the way we did stuff. So there's often things about your culture that are really important to keep, and you don't always know what they are. So that's hard to work out, but I would start having conversations or actually thinking about what do you want your culture to be like, how do we want people to communicate, what level of transparency do we want, how do we want it to look like in 3 to 5 years' time? I mean, what would it be like to come to work here? If I went and talked to one of the guys that worked for me in 5 years' time, what do I want them to say about the place? How do they make decisions? How do we create ideas? Do they feel like they're involved or not? Those sort of questions will help you contemplate kind of cultural issues. And the other thing I'd say is there are certain trigger points for cultural change that people stumble into inadvertently in startups. So the first one is when you start hiring outside your personal network. So startups all build, you hire from your people you know, your people you'll trust. Previous speakers were saying how important it is to know people for a long time when you bring them in. But there's a point in time when you go, we don't know anyone in our network that does that job. We need someone from outside that network. That's a cultural change right there, because you bring people in with another set of expectations and values and experiences. So, and especially if you suddenly bring in 5 or 6 people from outside your network, that's a change in your culture right there you should be aware of. When you go a little bit bigger and you start actually having departments, so it used to be everyone did everything, now we're starting to have departments. Another cultural change point. When you merge or get an acquisition, that's another cultural change point. When you relocate to another office, they're all cultural change points that will change your culture in some way, whether you like it or not, and whether it changes it in good or bad, it's kind of within your control if you choose to take control of it.
And we talked earlier about worker retention or hiring new people and the culture that can help deliver that. But what are the other big benefits of having a good culture at work?
It's kind of comes down to harmony, but harmony in a functional sense. So it comes down to speed and efficiency. So when you've got good culture and good fit, people communicate well, they tell each other stuff in the right way, they understand each other, and so things happen quickly. When the culture's starting to misalign or misfunction, things start taking longer, and as a leader, you spend more time dealing with people issues.
And you lose people that you probably don't want to lose.
And you lose people that you don't want to lose. So it's all, I mean, it introduces dysfunction, essentially.
I see a miss quite a lot. I think like people don't I always try and look at people's motivations. You know, for some people it's money, for some people they just want to fulfill. Some people actually want to, especially like in the more creative fields, they actually want to produce something tangible, something that they're kind of proud of versus just churn for years and years and have nothing to do. And I feel like understanding that, you're going to hang on to people better, because I think you can kind of have like a blanket policy about what works and what doesn't work. But actually, if you sit down and talk with people and understand their motivations, that's it.
And that's about fit. So that would be part of your recruitment process, is trying to work out what are their motivations and do they align with the way we want to do things. So, you know, you've heard a few speakers today talk about, recruiting for fit, and fit's more important than talent. Fit's more important than talent.
Interesting. Tom, in your case, was culture, did it happen organically, or did you have a vision for what you hoped it would look like?
I think you have a choice of either you define the culture or the culture defines itself. And I think if you allow the culture to define itself, it's probably not going to be where you want it to be. So it's kind of deliberate and conscious. And I would say it's, in the beginning, more of the startup stage, it's more incumbent on the founder or the senior folks to actually decide what that culture is going to be and create some sort of basic activities, just things for people to do, to participate in. And because they create stories, it's almost like a family. You're weaving together a bit of history together. You asked about benefits of having a culture, and I think you actually get to know people as human beings if you do it right. In an internet startup, it's a given. You're gonna show up early. You're gonna leave late. You're gonna be working nights and weekends. You're gonna be checking emails constantly. You're always on. And so just allowing them the space to understand them as fellow human beings, so that when you get into a crisis situation, you're not at each other's throats. I'll be kind of curious to see what happens with Apple as the stock continues to spiral down and Cook is under the microscope as CEO. Are those people going to pull together, or is the culture that that Steve Jobs created, as an incredible company as he is, so no disrespect to the man whatsoever, only admiration, but is that a culture where they know each other as human beings, and will they pull together or not? So that time will tell, I think, how that plays itself out.
Care to weigh in on that?
As a shareholder, I'm not sure I should comment on that. I think culture, I think it's more than just the fun stuff as well. I think it's what time you get into work, what time you leave, what do you do at lunch. It's interesting to see. I heard about some Australians who came over to interview in San Francisco, and the first day they had a big company party and they just got hammered and were kind of drunk and disrespectful, and they got fired on the first day.
Goodness.
So, just a warning.
I'm
still here, amazingly. But so I think, culture's so many things. It's I've worked for, I'm sure everyone has, but a really stressed out boss, and then that stress permeates throughout the whole company and everything else. So I think it's beyond just kind of the fun stuff and lunches and everything else. It's kind of do people feel like they have a voice, or they feel like they can, ask questions? It's the whole tone and manner of a place. So.
I would say one day I decided it wasn't a bad idea. We have a philosophy, which is actually an Einstein quote, which is, everything should be made as simple as possible, but no simpler. And so I painted it up on the wall. We have a big wall. It's probably 4 feet by 8 feet. And it's just kind of a constant reminder of what our shared philosophy is in the place. And I think it's just helped on a day-to-day basis to have that big reminder of what we stand for as an organization. So again, it's not all parties and fun. We integrate that stuff. But again, there is that glue about what is that shared vision? What is that shared value system? Is it Google's Organize the World's information kind of vision, so you know what you're all heading towards? No, a big fan.
What happens when cultures aren't implemented correctly? And this is open to everyone.
things go pear-shaped.
Yeah, things go pear-shaped quite fast.
Right.
So we often get engaged by large organisations like News Corp, big manufacturing organisations, because they've merged two teams, so it might be two sales teams, and within 3 weeks everyone hates each other's guts, and sales have dropped 30% year on year and market shares plummeted. So that's what happens when you get culture wrong in an extreme sense. But what happens in a startup world is it affects retention and it affects your ability to attract staff as well. The big thing about culture you need to understand is the right culture isn't just about the culture within your workplace. Culture is actually about aligning with the culture in your community. So it fits that way. So that's why the culture in Sydney or Beijing has to be different from the culture in Mountain View, because it's got to align with the external community. And if you look at the history of organisations, when they first started in the Industrial Revolution, if you were working in a factory, you were told what to do, you had no say, you didn't know what was going on. But if you look at their life in the community, they lived in a hierarchical society where they were probably illiterate, there was no TV, they didn't have a vote. So being treated like a mushroom at work was just the same as being treated like a mushroom at home. So the cultures were actually aligned. The problem is the social culture's changed, but organisations that have their roots in those worlds still have that legacy. And so your challenge as entrepreneurs is to build a culture that not only reflects where you want the organisation to go, but actually connects with your recruitment base for staff and your consumer base for customers.
Speaking of our entrepreneurs here, you know, they're startups predominantly. When should they start developing their culture?
Your culture has started to develop already. So it started.
Right.
So when you should start thinking about it? Probably yesterday.
Okay. You hear that, everyone? You know, I want to also find out or hear about you from, you know, which companies are really getting it right. When you think about great work cultures, which companies spring to mind?
The ones that really get it right don't employ us.
Right.
So, just so you know, we thrive on the reliable fallibility of large organisations to, you know, or the reliable nature of them buggering stuff up. We kind of thrive on that. But I've worked with a couple of organisations that have got it really right, that have gone through growth. So Boost Mobile was a startup in Australia. It was a telco. I was in the room right at the start when there were only 3 or 4 people in the room, and then they brought it to the US, and it's now owned by Sprint, and it's huge. Like, and I was involved with the US growth from when it was 10 people through to 500, and they really got it right, and they invested in it. And I remember they invested in all those sorts of activities and workshops. And one of the things we really stressed, and you said it, Andy, it's not about fun. It might be about fun, but it's not about making everybody happy. Some people won't like that culture. So it's about fit and the way you want the culture and your brand to resonate together. So they did a really good job of it. And one of the other companies or organisations I work with really, really closely is Movember, the charity, which Adam Garoni, one of the co-founders, is coming up in the next panel. Right. They've really focused on culture, really done it as parts, like deep in their DNA. It's very strongly connected to their brand and brand values. And one of the things they do really well, and one of the things you can think of when you're trying to develop your culture is not just what is it you want it to be, but what do you not want it to be? So what would you not do? So if you got your culture right, it actually helps make you make decisions about what you will and won't do.
Interesting. Any other advice you can give to our entrepreneurs from Facebook or Google?
We haven't talked too much about failure. I mean, Andy touched on this quite a bit in his talk, but I think it's important. It's extremely important. In fact, I would argue it's necessary to tolerate, not just tolerate failure, but actually to embrace it and, you know, look at failure as not a bad thing, but an opportunity to learn. And so you've got to make that, you know, that's got to be part of your culture early on, because if you're shutting down opportunities to explore new ideas, and frankly, the best way to explore an idea, if you're a software startup, is to actually prototype it, even better, launch it. A lot of these are going to fail, you know, because, you know, maybe the idea was malformed or the execution was, you know, wasn't perfect. Not that perfection is the goal, by the way. Done is always better than perfect, to quote Sheryl Sandberg. I don't know what the origin of that quote is, but getting stuff out there is important. But also realizing that, you know, you will make mistakes. Failure is okay. So I think that's something is really important to not just accept in your culture, but to embrace.
Any final words of advice? And if not, I'll open up for questions. Go ahead.
The failure thing's important, and that
Yeah.
connects to trust. So we have an environment where I trust that it's okay to fail.
Right.
And so I think one of the other things I'd say is one of the really powerful things you can do in your culture is consciously work on having a culture of positive communication and encouragement. So there's, in team sport, I have a sports psychology background. There's at the very simplistic level, there's internal and external motivation. So internal motivation is what does an individual say to themselves, or what does a team, how does a team work together to do their work, and how do they work together under pressure, versus external motivation is the rewards you get from doing stuff. So what you want to do is build a positive internal motivation culture that allows trust, failure, all of that stuff to exist. And one of the key things you can do is increase your positive communication techniques by focusing on what you want people to do and how you do it better rather than what they're doing wrong. And so one of the reasons why that book's out there is because that book captures a really simple technique that, introduced into work cultures, can increase trust, encouragement, and all those positive things pretty bloody easily.
Excellent. Well, has anyone got any questions for our panellists? Yep, I think there's one back there. We'll wait for a microphone.
Hi, thanks for a really interesting discussion. I'm curious, given the title of the panel, that we're looking to create a culture that supports creative thinking and innovation. When you're hiring your team and you're looking for people that share your values, how do you balance that sort of strong pull to hire people like you who have the same values as you, with hiring for diversity so that you have a team that thinks differently and creatively?
I guess in a creative organization, my philosophy is tension's actually a good thing. So, I mean, you need people who believe in the same things as you do, in the sense that they're not going to embezzle from you, for instance. It's hard to know up front, but we really aim to have a very diverse sort of base, and we do a lot of work globally. We're in Brazil, China, India, Western Europe, and so just being connected to all those cultures constantly to understand sort of the nuances and differences is really what expands your mind. So I think it is easy to fall in the trap. Somebody shows up. Andy and I are wearing very similar shirts. He and I used to work together.
There
Yeah, so is Eric.
We almost have shirt diversity.
Yeah.
Well, not quite.
So anyway, I think that is a goal, a very conscious goal of not, do they kind of mirror me, but are they really going to challenge me and make me think about creativity and innovation in fundamentally different ways, whether that's someone who's an artist or an engineer or a poet or somebody completely different.
I'd add that you have to think of diversity in your organization a bit like you think about culture in general. In other words, you have to essentially design for it, and it's too easy to make the mistake that it will just kind of happen. We'll be looking for the people that share our values, and by the way, we'll get the diversity as well, because it probably won't. And if you're not consciously planning for diversity and looking for diversity and actually have people in your organization that are keeping you honest. I mean, Google has a diversity organization to ensure that our recruiting organization is actually doing the right things, for example. And that doesn't address, that certainly is only part of it, because you've actually got to make sure that everyone in the organization values diversity and values inclusion, and that becomes, a very active part of your culture.
I was just going to add to it. I think that if a company has a North Star, so everyone's going for the same goal, then you can kind of hire around that if they buy into that bigger picture. But it's kind of nearly interesting in terms of diversity, say being an Australian working out here, having a job like at Facebook or Apple. I got interviewed by Boss Magazine a while back, and they kept asking me all these questions about being Australian, what's it like to be an Australian in a meeting, and it's like, I don't want to lead with being Australian. I'm a proud Australian. I don't try and hide my accent or anything like that. But I just kind of want to be known for what I bring to the table rather than my nationality or my sex or anything like that. And I think in Silicon Valley, it's a place where that gets respect.
Great. I think there's one other question down here. Oh, sorry, one up there first.
Change his mind.
Hi. Could I just expand the scope of this conversation a little bit? Just looking at what's going on in the globe, there's this fundamental restructuring of the economies of the Western civilization. And it seems like growth seems to be increasingly the only way out of the difficulties we're facing. and that growth is driven by innovation. So could you just speak to building a global culture that supports creative thinking and innovation?
The answer to that question would, I think, take more time than we have. But I think the previous question about diversity is actually part of the answer, because, I mean, it's one of the reasons, for example, Google has a very large number of engineering presences around the world, much more so than your typical multinational. You know, we have dozens and dozens of engineering centres. Is because we're trying to tap into, well, firstly, we're trying to tap into talent in locations around the world, and by doing so enable our ability to scale our ability to recruit people, but also we're tapping into, you know, different cultures and different ways of thinking and essentially diversity. So it's, again, it has to be designed into your company culture. You've got to think about, you know, how do you leverage, how do you essentially utilize people around the world, basically. Now, turning it around, I think you were saying, well, how do you encourage creative thinking and innovation around the world? I think, look, I'd be speculating, but I think, I mean, a lot of the values that have worked very, very well in Silicon Valley actually are transplantable. I mean, and certainly Google's philosophy has been to kind of, define a very relatively small number of values that we care about. And you'll hear things like, focus on the user and all else will follow. Well, that's a principle that should apply globally. So if you can kind of hone down your most important values to just a few, principles like that, I think there's no reason why you couldn't globalize it. That would be our view anyway.
Yeah, I think that I'd answer that two ways. So is it possible to create what do you have to do to create an innovative culture locally? There's a bunch of things you need to do, and you need to choose to do that, and you need to focus and embed on it. You need to create a positive, internally motivated workplace, and you need to create an environment where during the creative phase you remove judgment and allow for, so that you remove the why won't it work and change it to how could we make it work, and you embed that into your cultural thinking, and you connect that with the values of your organisation. And if you do that in a solid way locally, the question then becomes, okay, now we're now opening an office in LA or New York or Paris or wherever. Does that office need to be a local office or a global network, and what's the balance between that? So are we trying to become a global organisation that has local offices, or are we an organisation that has lots of offices in different parts of the globe? And that'll give you a different mix of global versus local. And then you need to be thinking about, well, how do we take our values and express them in a local environment in a way that's relevant? And again, you can choose to do that. There's no doubt you can choose to do that. And when Adam talks to you about Movember has done that in a really powerful and excellent way.
I don't know if I could add to that is, I guess I'm a big student of swarm intelligence as an emerging kind of type of intelligence, because we're all so interconnected now. And you look at the way a lot of the problems are solved, incorporating big data and crowdsourcing. I think there's going to be a profound shift in the way that we do innovate by incorporating more of a swarm intelligent kind of model or metric in the equation.
And finally?
I was going to say, I think, start with scale. Think about scale for your ideas. So, something like Facebook, we can connect families together in Indonesia. It's got nothing to do with Silicon Valley. Or we can, a business can connect over in Fiji or something like that. So set up your companies so they can scale in a relevancy to that, geographic region. It's not kind of restricted by something else. I think if you can do that, then you'll be sitting up here with Mike next time.
Excellent. Well, on that note, thank you so much, gentlemen, for your excellent comments. Please join me in giving our panellists a round of applause.